Kevin told me to stop wasting his money. His money. I built that company before he could spell his own name. I nodded, drove home, and called the attorney who drafted my first contracts in 1987. That sentence, his money, stayed with me the entire drive back from that restaurant on a humid Tuesday night in late September. It sat in the passenger seat beside me like a third person, like something breathing and alive. I kept both hands on the wheel, the way my own father taught me, the way I always drove when I needed to think clearly and not let emotion steer. The Memphis skyline receded in my rearview mirror, all those familiar lights blurring slightly at the edges, the way they do when you've had one glass of wine more than you intended. I hadn't been drinking heavily. I rarely do anymore. But something about that night made the city look unfamiliar, like I was seeing it through someone else's windshield, from someone else's life. Let me tell you what it cost to build Vance HVAC distribution from nothing. It cost me the cartilage in my left knee, worn down from crawling through industrial crawl spaces and basement utility corridors during the first 7 years, when I couldn't yet afford to hire a crew and did every service call myself. It cost me 3 missed anniversaries and a summer vacation to the Smoky Mountains that my late wife, Patricia, never once complained about missing, but that I have never forgiven myself for. It cost me 17-hour days and a recurring shoulder injury from loading pallets of compressor units at our first warehouse on Summer Avenue, a warehouse so small you had to turn sideways between certain shelving rows. It cost me 2 personal loans, one from a bank that took 6 months to approve, and one from Patricia's father, who handed me the check across his kitchen table without any paperwork and told me he expected only one thing in return: that I build something his daughter could be proud of. I built it. Lord, I built it. By 1994, Vance HVAC Distribution was supplying residential and commercial HVAC units, replacement parts, and specialty refrigerant lines to contractors across a 4-state region: Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, and the western edge of Alabama. We had 31 full-time employees by then, most of them local, most of them people I knew by name and by family, people whose kids I'd watched grow up in the parking lot during company picnics. By 2005, that number was 78. By 2015, we were operating out of a 40,000-square-foot primary distribution facility in southeast Memphis, with 2 auxiliary storage depots and a small fleet of company trucks. We had contracts with major commercial builders, municipal HVAC upgrade programs, and 3 school district maintenance partnerships that I was genuinely proud of because they meant something beyond the revenue line. I was not a reckless man with money. I was deliberate. I understood margins the way some men understand scripture, not just the words, but the meaning underneath the words. I knew what a half-point variance in freight cost could do to a quarterly projection. I knew the difference between a vendor who was nickel and diming me on packaging and one who was genuinely trying to absorb cost on my behalf. I built that business on precision and patience, and on relationships I cultivated over decades, the kind of relationships where a handshake still meant something because I made sure it always did. Kevin joined the company formally in 2009, after finishing his MBA at Vanderbilt. I won't pretend I wasn't proud. I was enormously proud. He was sharp with numbers in a particular way that business school sharpens people, fast with spreadsheets, fluent in the language of optimization and scalability. He talked about market positioning and brand equity and operational efficiency with the kind of easy confidence that comes from studying businesses rather than bleeding to build one. I welcomed that. I thought we could balance each other. I thought his theoretical fluency combined with my operational instinct would make the company stronger than either of us alone. For the first few years, that was mostly true. But somewhere around 2017 or 2018, something shifted in Kevin's relationship to the company and to me. It was subtle at first, the way erosion is subtle. You don't notice the cliff retreating until one morning a significant piece of it has simply fallen away. He began reframing conversations in ways that positioned me as an obstacle rather than a founder. He used language in board meetings. And yes, by then we had a small formal board, 4 people including Kevin, myself, our CFO Margaret Holloway, and a regional business advisor named Porter Sims, that framed my long-standing relationships with employees and vendors as inefficiencies rather than assets. He described my charitable initiatives, the annual donation to the Memphis area legal services, and the quarterly gift to the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital that Patricia and I had maintained since 1998 as discretionary spending that needed to be evaluated against ROI. The retirement conversation happened in October of 2 years ago. Kevin requested a private meeting in the conference room at the Summer Avenue facility, which I still thought of as my original warehouse, even though we'd expanded and renovated it twice over. He brought Dana, which I found odd because Dana had no official role in the company at that point, or so I believed. She sat to Kevin's left with a pad folio open in front of her, and a particular expression on her face that I can only describe as rehearsed, the look of someone who has practiced being measured and professional, and has perhaps overdone it slightly. Kevin told me they'd been speaking with an organizational consultant and had concluded that the company would benefit from what he called a leadership transition. He was prepared to offer me an advisory position, a formal pension structure, and continued quarterly distributions from profits. He presented it as a generous arrangement. I was 65 years old. My knee had been replaced the previous spring. My doctor had been telling me for 2 years that my blood pressure was a management concern, and Patricia had been gone for 3 years by then, which meant the house I came home to every evening was very quiet, and the reasons to be in the office at 6 in the morning were different than they used to be. I am not too proud to admit that part of me was tired. Not broken, not finished. Just genuinely tired in the way that men who have worked without ceasing for 4 decades become tired when the season for it arrives. So I agreed to the transition. I signed the documents Arthur Pendleton reviewed for me, documents that formalized my retirement from day-to-day operations, while retaining my minority ownership stake and my rights to the quarterly distributions. I did not sign away my signatory rights on 3 specific accounts, and I will explain why in a moment. At the time, I accepted the arrangement in good faith. I believed Kevin intended to honor it. For approximately 18 months, he did. The distributions arrived on schedule. The pension structure Kevin had promised was funded correctly, at least on paper. I kept a distance from operational decisions out of respect for the agreement, and out of a genuine desire to give Kevin the room to lead without his father looking over his shoulder. I took up woodworking. I had lunch twice a week with retired friends. I served on a volunteer advisory board for a small Memphis nonprofit that helped returning veterans find trade employment, which felt meaningful and cost me nothing but time. Then came the dinner. It was a Tuesday in late September. Kevin called 2 days prior and suggested we meet for a family dinner, just the 3 of us, and named a restaurant in East Memphis I'd never been to, the kind of place with exposed Edison bulbs and a menu printed on brown paper, and entrees that cost more than my first week's payroll in 1987. I dressed appropriately, wore the gray sport coat Patricia had given me for my 62nd birthday, and arrived on time. Kevin and Dana were already seated when I arrived, which I noted because Kevin had never been early to anything in his life. The restaurant was loud with the pleasant noise of a full Tuesday evening crowd, glasses and silverware, and overlapping conversations creating a hum that made the table feel simultaneously private and exposed. Dana was wearing something that projected occasion, a structured blazer, small gold earrings, her dark hair pinned back with a deliberateness that matched the expression I remembered from that conference room 2 years prior. Kevin was in a button-down, no tie, the rolled sleeve look he'd adopted in recent years that I suspected was supposed to signal a particular kind of relaxed authority. We ordered. We made the kind of small talk that functions as staging before a conversation neither party wants to have directly. Dana asked about my volunteer work with the Veterans Board. Kevin mentioned a potential new commercial contract with a hotel development group out of Nashville. I told them the woodworking was coming along, that I'd finished a small side table for the screened porch, and was considering a bookcase for the study. Then Dana opened the pad folio she'd brought to dinner. At a dinner, with a pad folio. She explained that she and Kevin had been working with a strategic advisory firm over the past 4 months, on a comprehensive restructuring of the company's financial and operational architecture. She used those exact words: comprehensive restructuring, financial and operational architecture. I listened without interrupting, which has always been one of my more useful skills. She outlined several components of this restructuring in a tone that was carefully calibrated to sound informational rather than confrontational, as if she were briefing a stakeholder rather than informing a founder that he was being systematically removed from the financial life of his own creation. The pension structure, she explained, was being dissolved and replaced with a lump sum settlement offer. The quarterly distributions were being reduced by 70%, which she framed as a temporary measure tied to a reinvestment phase, but which the documents in her padfolio did not indicate any sunset clause or restoration mechanism for. The company's name, Vance Hayvac Distribution, the name I'd chosen because it meant something, because it was my family's name attached to my family's work, was being rebranded. Kevin cut in at that point, animated and confident, to explain that market research suggested the Vance name had low regional recognition beyond the trade community, and that the new identity, he mentioned something with the word apex in it, would position the company for broader commercial appeal. I sat with all of this for a moment. I took a sip of water. I set the glass down carefully. Kevin, emboldened perhaps by my silence, leaned forward and launched into the piece of the conversation that I suspect he had been building toward, and that his wife had perhaps wisely tried to preempt with the formal presentation approach. He talked about efficiency. He talked about profit optimization. He talked about how certain commitments I'd maintained for decades, the charitable donations, the supplemental support payments I'd been quietly continuing to 3 retired employees who'd been with me since the early years and whose retirement funds hadn't fully matured, were draining resources that needed to be redeployed into growth initiatives. He said I needed to stop wasting his money. Not the company's money, his money. I looked at my son across that restaurant table with the Edison bulbs burning amber above us and the sound of other people's pleasant evenings filling the air around us, and I understood with perfect clarity several things simultaneously. I understood that the dinner had not been a family gathering. It had been a legal and financial notification, delivered in a setting designed to make objections seem unseemly. I understood that Dana's padfolio contained documents she expected me to sign that evening, or in the days immediately following. I understood that Kevin had convinced himself, genuinely and completely, that the company was his, not in the sense that he ran it and had significant authority over it, but in the deeper, more absolute sense, that he believed the history of it belonged to him as well, that the 38 years I had spent constructing it had somehow become his inheritance, not through grief and loss, but through simple reassignment. And I understood, with the particular cold clarity that comes to men of my age and experience, when someone makes a significant miscalculation in front of them, that Kevin had made a very serious mistake. I set down my fork. I nodded slowly, the way I used to nod when a vendor presented me with an inflated quote, and I was deciding not to reveal yet that I knew it was inflated. I said that he was right. I said I'd stop. I said I appreciated them sharing the restructuring plans with me, and that I would review the settlement documents when they sent them over formally. Kevin visibly relaxed. Dana made a note in her padfolio. I excused myself to the restroom, stood at the sink for 60 seconds with the water running cold over my wrists, a trick Patricia's cardiologist had told her once about managing sharp emotional spikes, and then I dried my hands, straightened the gray sport coat, and walked back to the table to finish my dinner with my son and his wife in perfect, patient composure. I drove home alone. I sat in the driveway for 3 minutes. Then I went inside, found Arthur Pendleton's home number in the address book I've kept in the same kitchen drawer since 1989, and made the call that would determine the next 6 weeks of all of our lives. Arthur Pendleton answered on the 4th ring, which for a man of 73 at 9:40 on a Tuesday evening, I considered both impressive and characteristic. Arthur had been my corporate attorney since the company's founding. He was the kind of lawyer who had been practicing long enough to have seen nearly every configuration of human greed and folly, and who had therefore developed the useful habit of being unsurprised by most things, while remaining meticulously engaged with all of them. He had a dry voice that tended toward understatement, and a legal memory that I had found reliable in the way that good tools are reliable, precisely because it was never flashy about itself. I told him I'd had an interesting dinner with Kevin and Dana. He asked what kind of interesting. I told him, the kind where someone informs you that your pension is being dissolved and your name is being stripped from your own company. There was a brief pause. Then Arthur said, in the tone of a man retrieving a file from a very organized mental cabinet, that before I did anything else, I should let him look again at the original 1987 corporate documents, not the 2023 Retirement Transition Agreement. The original 1987 Articles of Incorporation and the bank signatory records from the 3 accounts we'd opened at First Tennessee Bank during the company's founding year. I told him I remembered those accounts. He told me I should. The history of those 3 accounts requires some explanation, because it is the kind of detail that seems bureaucratic until it becomes consequential, at which point it seems instead like either remarkable foresight or extraordinary luck, depending on how charitable you want to be about my intentions at the time. When I incorporated Vance HVAC Distribution in March of 1987, I opened 3 separate operating accounts at First Tennessee Bank. The first was the primary operating account, through which the vast majority of daily business transactions flowed. The second was what I called the reserve account, designated for capital equipment purchases and large inventory acquisitions. The third was a quieter account, one I funded steadily over years from a portion of profits I moved there manually, which I always thought of as the foundation account, money that sat underneath the visible business operations, like the concrete footer beneath a building, present and structural but not part of the daily working surface. When Kevin took over and we transitioned the company's banking relationships as part of the operational modernization he implemented in his first 2 years of full leadership, the primary and reserve accounts were closed and replaced with accounts at a regional commercial banking partner that Kevin had arranged through a business school contact. 2 of the 3 original 1987 accounts, the primary and the reserve, were formally closed and their balances consolidated. The third account, the foundation account, was not closed. It was not closed because in 1987, when I set it up, Arthur had drafted the signatory authorization for that account in a specific way. The signatory clause required co-authorization from both the founding account holder and a second designated party for any closure or full dissolution of the account. The second designated party in 1987 was Arthur himself, in his capacity as corporate counsel, a structure he had recommended based on his experience with founder-operated businesses, where a single signatory arrangement on a reserve account created vulnerability during partnership disputes or succession transitions. When Kevin's team moved the banking relationships in 2021, they cataloged the 1987 accounts based on the corporate records Kevin had been given access to. Those records reflected the primary and reserve accounts prominently. The foundation account appeared in an older filing structure, cross-referenced through the 1987 articles rather than the modernized corporate record system Kevin's organizational consultant had built. It was overlooked, not maliciously, not with any particular negligence, simply missed, the way quiet things that don't announce themselves are sometimes missed. The account had continued to receive periodic deposits over the years through 2 automatic transfer protocols I'd set up in the late 1990s and never formally discontinued, small percentage allocations from specific vendor rebate categories that flowed in quarterly. Over 20-plus years of compounding and accumulation, including several larger discretionary transfers I'd made during particularly profitable quarters when I wanted to ensure the foundation was substantial, the account held $2,347,000. Arthur confirmed this on our phone call after spending approximately 90 minutes the following morning reviewing the original documents he kept in his physical archive. Arthur maintained paper files on everything, a habit I had always quietly respected and now found myself actively grateful for. He confirmed that the dormant co-signatory clause on the 1987 foundation account remained legally valid and operative. He confirmed that Harold Vance, as the founding account holder, retained full unilateral authority to access, transfer, or otherwise direct the funds in that account, with the co-signatory provision applying only to closure or dissolution, not to standard withdrawal or transfer activity. He confirmed that Kevin Vance had no signatory authority on that account whatsoever. I want to be precise about my emotional state during this period, because I think it matters to understanding what I did next and why I did it the way I did it. I was not operating from rage. Rage is imprecise and counterproductive, and tends to make people do things quickly that they should do slowly. What I was operating from was something quieter and considerably more focused, a kind of cold, professional clarity that I recognized from certain moments in the business's history, moments when I had identified a situation that required an exact, deliberate response, and had understood that I was the person in possession of the information and the competence to deliver it. I spent 2 days sitting with what Arthur had told me before I moved to the next step. The next step was the digital audit. When Kevin transitioned into operational leadership, I had voluntarily stepped back from the company's internal systems as part of demonstrating my good faith commitment to the transition. I stopped logging into the financial management software. I stopped accessing the internal ledger system, but I had never formally surrendered my administrator credentials because no one had ever formally asked me to. My credentials existed in the system as a legacy-level access profile, the kind that sits dormant in enterprise software, the way old accounts do when organizations grow and change and forget to fully clean their access histories. I had not used them in nearly 2 years. I used them on a Thursday evening, sitting at the desk in my study with a cup of coffee and my reading glasses and the careful, methodical attention I used to bring to quarterly financial reviews. The software system Kevin had implemented was newer than what I'd used during my tenure, but the underlying architecture of financial ledgers doesn't change in its logic, only in its interface. I knew what I was looking at. I knew how to read it. I started with the vendor account register and began moving backward through the monthly records, the way you read a story from the ending, if you want to understand how the author constructed it. I was looking for nothing specific, or rather I was looking for the general shape of something wrong, the way an experienced reader recognizes a forged document, not from any single detail, but from the cumulative texture of small inconsistencies. I found it within 40 minutes. There was a vendor designated in the system as Meridian Logistics Partners. They appeared in the records with monthly invoices of precisely $40,000, categorized under freight and distribution management services. The invoices were consistent, same amount, same vendor designation, same expense category, appearing in the ledger on the 14th of every month, with payment authorized and released within 48 hours. 32 consecutive months. $1,280,000 in total authorized payments to Meridian Logistics Partners. I spent 20 minutes searching for Meridian Logistics Partners in every trade directory and commercial registration database I could access from my browser. I found a Tennessee business entity registration, filed 33 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm I didn't recognize. The listed business address was a commercial mail service location on Poplar Avenue. There was no website. There were no reviews. There was no evidence of any actual logistics operations. No fleet, no facility, no regulatory filings with the Department of Transportation, no presence in any freight carrier database. Meridian Logistics Partners did not exist as a functioning business. It was a shell, a phantom vendor constructed for the sole purpose of receiving authorized company payments. $40,000 per month, every month, like clockwork, for nearly 3 years. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling of my study for a long moment. Because I knew this scheme. I knew it not abstractly, not from research or from watching it used by someone else. I knew it from the inside, from the perspective of the person who had designed it. In 1994, when Vance HVAC Distribution was navigating a complex IRS audit related to our rapid growth and some aggressive but legal tax positioning my original accountant had advised, I had constructed a temporary vendor account arrangement to manage cash flow in a way that created certain documentation buffers during the audit period. It was entirely legal. The payments represented genuine business costs that I'd simply reorganized through a structured vendor format. But the architectural logic of it, the use of a designated vendor account to direct and control specific cash flows, was something I had developed myself and had explained to no one except Patricia and my accountant, who passed away in 2007. Except, apparently, Kevin. Because the structure I was looking at in the ledger, the invoice format, the payment timing, the expense categorization, even the choice of a logistics designation to justify the payment, was built on the exact same logic I had used in 1994. Kevin had found my original documentation somewhere in the company's old records, understood the mechanism, and adapted it. Except where my 1994 arrangement had served a legitimate operational purpose during a genuine audit challenge, Kevin's arrangement served no purpose except to move $40,000 per month from the company's operating accounts into whatever banking vehicle Meridian Logistics Partners was designed to funnel funds toward, which, I had very little doubt, was ultimately Kevin's personal financial life. The amount was not a coincidence either. $40,000 per month is $480,000 per year. Over 32 months, Kevin had moved approximately $1.28 million out of the company through this mechanism. That was not the spontaneous financial opportunism of someone who'd stumbled onto an easy method. That was a planned, sustained extraction, the behavior of someone who had decided that the company's operating reserves were a resource to be harvested, rather than an asset to be preserved. I closed the ledger software. I removed my reading glasses. I sat for a moment in the quiet of my study, and I allowed myself to feel what I felt, which was something too layered to be called simply anger or simply grief. It was the particular compound feeling that arrives when you discover that someone you loved and trusted and invested your life in building toward has not merely disappointed you, but has actively exploited the very knowledge and systems and structures you built, has used the inheritance of your professional life as a vehicle for their own dishonesty. I let myself feel it fully for approximately 5 minutes. Then I picked up a legal pad, found a sharp pencil, and began making a list of exactly what I was going to need. The first thing I did the following Monday morning was call Arthur Pendleton and schedule an in-person meeting at his office on Union Avenue, which he had occupied for so long that the building had essentially organized itself around his presence. His office smelled of old paper and good coffee, and a particular kind of professional permanence that I had always found steadying. We sat across from each other with the original 1987 documents spread across his conference table, and a fresh set of transfer authorization forms that his paralegal had prepared, based on Arthur's review of the signatory clause's current operative status. Arthur walked me through the mechanism precisely, and without any editorial comment on what I was doing or why, which was one of the qualities I valued most in him. He was not there to counsel me on the family dimension of the situation. He was there to ensure that what I did was legally airtight, and he brought to that task the full weight of 41 years of corporate practice. The dormant co-signatory clause gave me unilateral authority to initiate transfer transactions from the 1987 foundation account. The destination account, for my purposes, was a limited liability company I registered that same week. The registration process for a Tennessee single-member LLC is not complicated when you have an experienced attorney managing it and no organizational complexity to navigate. It took Arthur's office 2.5 business days to complete the registration, obtain the EIN, and open a business checking account at a regional bank entirely separate from any financial institution with which Vance Vac Distribution had any relationship. I named it Vance Holdings LLC. The name was deliberate. I wanted the name on the destination account to carry the family name that Kevin had decided to strip from the company. I wanted the Vance name to go somewhere it would be honored. Arthur's paralegal processed the wire transfer authorization on a Wednesday morning. The full balance of the 1987 foundation account, $2,347,212.60, was transferred to the Vance Holdings LLC business checking account. The transfer cleared the following business day. First Tennessee Bank, which had maintained the account for 38 years, processed the transfer without incident. The account remained open with a nominal balance, as closing it would have required co-signatory authorization that I chose not to invoke, for reasons that were partly legal prudence, and partly the particular satisfaction of knowing that the account would simply sit there, quietly present in the corporate records, for however long it needed to. I do not know precisely when Kevin became aware that the funds were gone. I suspect it was during a routine financial review by his CFO, or perhaps when a treasury management notification came through from the legacy banking system. It may have taken several days. I was not monitoring for his discovery. I was focused on the next task, which was considerably more painstaking and considerably more important for the specific outcome I was pursuing. Compiling the forensic documentation on Kevin's Meridian Logistics Partners scheme took me 11 days. Not because the evidence was difficult to find, I had already located the core of it in my initial evening review, but because I was not interested in a rough summary of suspicious transactions. I was interested in building an undeniable, professionally organized documentary record of the kind that an experienced auditing firm would recognize immediately as comprehensive and credible. I worked methodically, the way I had always worked when the work mattered. I accessed the internal ledger system again and extracted, one by one, each of the 32 Meridian Logistics Partners invoice records, printing each with the associated payment authorization documentation. Kevin had personally approved every invoice. His electronic authorization signature appeared on each transaction record. I cross-referenced each invoice against the company's actual freight and logistics vendor records to document the absence of any corresponding legitimate service. Vance Havac Distribution had 3 contracted logistics vendors during the period covered by the Meridian invoices. None of them had processed any freight volumes that would have created excess capacity, requiring a 4th logistics vendor. The Meridian invoices described services, regional distribution management, route optimization support, interdepot logistics coordination, that were either already being handled by the existing vendor contracts or that described functions for which there was no operational record of execution. I then pulled the Tennessee business entity records for Meridian Logistics Partners and documented every detail. The registration date, which fell 33 months prior, 1 month before the first Meridian invoice appeared in the company ledger, the registered agent, the commercial mail service address, the absence of any Department of Transportation carrier registration, the absence of any commercial insurance filings, the absence of any freight broker licensing with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, a company receiving $40,000 per month for logistics services that lacked every regulatory and operational marker of an actual logistics company, was not an anomaly that required interpretive sophistication. It was a fact pattern that interpreted itself. I dug further. Through a combination of public records searches and the kind of patient document tracing that rewards careful attention rather than speed, I was able to identify a banking connection. Meridian Logistics Partners had opened a business account at a mid-size regional bank, not the company's primary banking institution, 14 days before the first invoice was submitted. The account had 2 authorized signatories. One was listed as a registered business representative using a name I didn't recognize. The second, identified as a secondary authorized account holder, was Kevin Vance. I sat with that document for a long time. Kevin hadn't merely adopted a scheme. He hadn't merely redirected corporate funds through a thin vendor fiction. He had personally maintained signatory control over the account receiving those funds. He had, in the precise legal sense, defrauded his own company, a company he had inherited the leadership of through a transition predicated on my trust and my good faith signature. I added the banking documentation to the file. The complete file, when organized, ran to 47 pages of primary documentation, invoice records, payment authorizations, vendor registration materials, regulatory absence documentation, and the banking records I had obtained. I had Arthur review it. He spent 2 days with it, made 3 requests for supplemental documentation that I provided, and then told me that what I had assembled was, in his professional assessment, a complete and sufficient forensic basis for triggering a mandatory investigative response from any competent external auditing firm. I asked Arthur to help me identify the correct point of contact at Hartwell & Green, the independent external auditing firm that Vance HVAC Distribution retained for its annual audits, a relationship I had established in 2011 and that had continued under Kevin's tenure. Arthur reached out to the firm's managing partner through a formal attorney-to-auditor communication channel, referencing specific provisions of the engagement letter between Hartwell & Green and Vance HVAC Distribution that obligated the firm to respond to material fraud disclosures from authorized parties. There was a reasonable question about whether I, as a retired founder with minority ownership but no active operational authority, constituted an authorized party under the engagement terms. Arthur argued, in the detailed legal letter he sent the managing partner, that my minority ownership stake gave me standing as a beneficial interest holder to report material information affecting the company's financial integrity, and that the firm's professional and regulatory obligations under applicable auditing standards created an independent duty to investigate credible fraud disclosures, regardless of their source within the ownership structure. Hartwell & Green's managing partner called Arthur back within 24 hours. They scheduled an urgent meeting with me for the following Thursday. I did not call Kevin. I did not send a letter. I did not give him any indication that anything was coming. This was a decision I made carefully and without hesitation. A man who has spent 3 years systematically stealing from his own company and then sat across a restaurant table from his father and told him to stop wasting money does not deserve the courtesy of a warning. More practically, a warning would have given him time to destroy documentation, restructure accounts, or construct a defensive narrative. I had built a case on evidence. I intended to deliver that case to people who were professionally obligated to act on it, and I intended to do it before Kevin had any reason to expect that his operation was compromised. The Thursday meeting with Hartwell & Green lasted 3 hours. I presented the file. The managing partner and their chief forensic audit specialist asked questions that were precise and specific, and which I was able to answer in every instance with a reference to a specific document in the 47-page file. By the end of the meeting, the forensic specialist had stopped asking questions and was making notes in a way that suggested the inquiry had moved from preliminary evaluation to active investigation planning. The managing partner shook my hand when I left and said only that they would be in touch. I drove home through Memphis on a clear October afternoon, the leaves turning in Overton Park as I passed, the city looking entirely itself and entirely familiar, and I felt something that I think was not satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction seemed too small for the weight of what was in motion, but rather the particular settled calm of a man who has done what needed to be done, with precision and care, and who now needs only to wait for the world to complete the action he has set in motion. I went home. I made dinner. I worked on the bookcase for the study. I waited. The Hartwell & Green audit team arrived at the Vance HVAC Distribution headquarters on a Monday morning at 8:15, 17 days after my meeting with the managing partner. I know the time because Margaret Holloway, the company's CFO who had been with the company since 2006 and who I had always trusted, called me at 8:43 that morning, ostensibly to ask if I knew anything about a scheduled audit review that Kevin had not mentioned to her. I told her honestly that I had provided Hartwell & Green with some information that warranted their attention, and that I expected they would explain the scope of their review to her and Kevin directly. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was careful but not unfriendly, that she understood. I appreciated that she didn't ask me to elaborate. The audit team was 4 people, 2 forensic specialists, a financial records analyst, and the firm's engagement lead for the Vance account, a methodical woman named Susan Bradshaw, whom I had met at the 2018 annual audit review, and whose professional reputation Arthur had confirmed was excellent. They arrived with document preservation notices, which they served on Kevin personally at 9:15 when he arrived at the office. Document preservation notices, for those unfamiliar, are formal legal instruments requiring the recipient to immediately cease any modification, deletion, or transfer of financial records, communications, or related documentation. They are not suggestions. They carry legal teeth, and Susan Bradshaw's team delivered them with the particular efficiency of professionals who have done this before, and understand that the first 45 minutes of a forensic audit arrival are often the most critical in terms of preventing evidence disruption. Kevin, from what I later learned through Margaret, and through a brief account offered by one of the junior account managers who'd witnessed the morning's events, did not handle the arrival well. He attempted initially to reframe the situation as a routine audit expansion, speaking over Susan Bradshaw as she outlined the scope of the investigation with a kind of performative composure that apparently convinced no one in the room. When Susan's financial analyst asked directly for access to the vendor account files and specifically named Meridian Logistics Partners, Kevin's composure broke. He demanded to know where that name had come from. Susan Bradshaw, from all accounts, simply repeated the document access request without responding to the question. Kevin called me at 11:20 that morning. I was in my woodworking space, fitting the first set of shelf brackets for the bookcase, when my phone rang. I saw his name. I set down my tools, wiped my hands on the work cloth, and answered. He was not calm. He was using the voice I recognized from his most defensive moments during board meetings, pressured and fast, the words coming slightly ahead of the thoughts behind them. He said the auditors were there. He said they were making serious allegations. He said he needed to understand what information I had given them and whether I understood what I was doing to the company by interfering. He used the word interfering, as though a man who built a company and discovered his son stealing from it was interfering by reporting it. I let him finish. I waited a full beat after his last sentence before I spoke. I told him I hadn't interfered with anything. I told him I had simply shared some financial information with the firm the company retained for exactly the purpose of reviewing financial information. I told him that if the information I'd shared was incorrect or incomplete, I was confident the auditors would determine that through their process. He said he needed to know about the foundation account. He'd discovered the transfer. He said I had no right to move those funds. I told him I had every right, as clearly established by the 1987 signatory clause that Arthur Pendleton had drafted and that remained legally operative, and that if he wished to contest that position, he was welcome to have his attorney contact Arthur. He said he needed that money back. He said the company was going to have a liquidity problem with the audit disrupting operations. His voice had shifted from pressured to something closer to frightened, and I want to be honest that recognizing the fear in my son's voice was not a simple thing to sit with. It was not a triumphant moment. It was a hard moment, the way hard moments always are when they involve people you once held as infants, and read to and watched learn to walk. But I thought of the 47-page file. I thought of 32 months of $40,000 per month. I thought of the restaurant, and the padfolio, and his money. I told Kevin that I was keeping my promise not to waste his money. I told him I said I would stop, and I had. He said nothing for 4 seconds. Then the call ended. The next 6 weeks had the quality of a slow machine doing its precise work. I was not inside it, not directly. I was standing at a sufficient distance to observe its operation without being caught in its mechanisms, which was exactly where I needed to be. What I know of those 6 weeks, I know from Margaret Holloway's careful accounts. She called me twice during the period, not to disclose confidential information, but simply, I believe, because she had been at the company long enough to feel the weight of what was happening and needed to acknowledge it to someone who understood. And from Arthur's legal communications as the situation developed, and from what became, in the final weeks, a matter of sufficient public financial record that the regional business press covered it in 2 separate articles. The audit's core finding was exactly what my documentation had indicated it would be. 32 months of fraudulent vendor payments to a shell entity under Kevin's personal signatory control, totaling $1,280,000 in company funds misappropriated for personal benefit. Susan Bradshaw's team also identified several secondary irregularities in expense authorization practices, smaller in scale, but consistent with a pattern of treating company resources as personal resources, that added an additional estimated $60,000 to the misappropriation total. With the $2.3 million operating reserve absent from the company's balance sheet and the audit's fraud findings, triggering a mandatory disclosure to the company's primary banking institution, the bank moved swiftly to freeze Vance HVAC Distribution's existing lines of credit. This was not a punitive action on the bank's part. It was standard risk management protocol in response to a material fraud disclosure during an active audit. But its practical effect was to remove Kevin's ability to use credit facilities to bridge the liquidity gap created by the reserve transfer. The company had operational obligations that the remaining liquid assets could not cover, supplier accounts that required payment, payroll cycles that required funding, contractual commitments to commercial clients that required operational capacity to fulfill. Without the credit lines, without the operating reserves, and with the audit creating an environment of institutional uncertainty that made new credit arrangements effectively unavailable, Kevin had no mechanism to maintain the company's operations at their existing level. Within 4 weeks of the audit's initiation, 2 of the company's 3 largest commercial contracts had suspended their relationships pending resolution of the audit findings. A major supplier had placed the account on credit hold. Kevin, I was told, had attempted to raise emergency bridge financing through 3 separate contacts: a Nashville-based private equity relationship, a Memphis commercial lender, and a private investor I didn't know, and had been unsuccessful with all 3. The fraud audit findings were not confidential once they triggered regulatory reporting obligations, and the business community in Memphis is not so large that word of material fraud findings at a regional company of Vance's profile moved slowly. At week 5, Kevin's attorney sent a formal letter to Arthur Pendleton proposing a negotiated settlement. Harold would return a portion of the transferred funds in exchange for Kevin withdrawing from the company and releasing Harold from any claims related to the transfer. Arthur called me to discuss it. I told Arthur that I had no interest in a private settlement that protected Kevin from the consequences of what he had done. I told Arthur to decline. In week 6, unable to meet payroll, unable to pay 2 critical suppliers whose accounts payable terms had lapsed, and facing a formal demand from a commercial client for breach of contract, Kevin's attorney filed the documents that placed Vance HVAC Distribution in court-appointed receivership. The court-appointed receiver was a commercial restructuring specialist named Hammond, whose job it was to take control of the company's assets, stabilize its immediate obligations to the extent possible, and ultimately prepare the business for either reorganization or sale, whichever the financial reality supported. The financial reality, as Hammond's preliminary assessment made clear, did not support reorganization under Kevin's continued leadership. The fraud findings, the frozen credit, the damaged vendor and client relationships, the absence of operating reserves, the company that had been Vance HVAC Distribution was not, in its current condition, a viable going concern under its existing management and ownership structure. It was an asset portfolio, a receivership asset portfolio. Hammond scheduled an asset auction. I received formal notice of the auction through Arthur, who was monitoring the receivership proceedings. I read the notice at my kitchen table on a gray November morning with my second cup of coffee. The company I had built across 38 years of my working life was going to be sold at auction to satisfy its obligations and whatever recovery value the receivership process could generate for creditors. I sat with that for a moment. Not with grief, exactly. The grief had been earlier, had happened in layers over the past weeks, as I watched the reporting and received Margaret's careful updates. What I felt at the kitchen table that morning was something more like resolve. Clothoma man. The clarity of a man who knows what he is going to do next, and who has been waiting, with patience, for the moment to do it. I called Arthur and told him to prepare the bid documentation. The asset auction was scheduled for a Thursday morning in December at the offices of Hammond's receivership firm on Madison Avenue, a formal proceeding conducted by a court officer with registered bidders and a structured submission process. Arthur had helped me prepare and register as a qualified bidder through Vance Holdings LLC, the entity that held the $2.3 million I had transferred from the 1987 foundation account. The registration process had required financial disclosure documentation, proof of funds, and a statement of acquisition intent, all of which Arthur managed with his customary precision. I want to be clear about the financial arithmetic of what I was about to do, because the arithmetic is part of the story, and I have always believed that honesty about money is a form of respect for the people you're speaking to. When Kevin assumed full operational leadership of Vance Fac Distribution, the company carried a professional valuation of approximately $2,900,000, based on a formal business valuation, conducted as part of the transition documentation. That valuation reflected the operating reserves, the vendor and client relationship portfolio, the physical assets, inventory, equipment, fleet, lease agreements, and a reasonable multiple of the company's annual EBITDA at the time. Hammond's receivership assessment valued the current asset portfolio at approximately $2,100,000. The reduction reflected the fraud-damaged vendor relationships, the suspended commercial contracts, the absence of operating reserves, and the intangible value destruction associated with a public fraud disclosure. The company's brand equity, already weakened by Kevin's aborted rebranding effort, which had been launched and then frozen by the receivership, was not something Hammond's team attributed significant independent value to. My acquisition target was the full asset portfolio, including the physical distribution assets, the existing vendor contract infrastructure, the client relationship documentation, the fleet, and the facility lease agreements. I intended to bid comprehensively, not selectively, because I wasn't interested in acquiring pieces of the company. I was interested in restoring it. There were two other registered bidders at the auction. One was a regional commercial asset acquisition firm that I knew to be primarily interested in the physical inventory and the fleet. They would have stripped what they wanted and sold the rest. The second was a mid-sized HVAC distribution company out of Nashville that I suspected was interested in the client relationships and the Memphis market position. Both were legitimate buyers with legitimate interests. Neither of them had what I had, which was the specific, total knowledge of what that company was actually worth when led by someone who understood it from its foundation. Vance Holdings LLC submitted a bid of $2,140,000 for the complete asset portfolio. The Nashville company bid $1,650,000 for the client contracts and selected inventory categories. The asset acquisition firm bid $1,200,000 for physical assets only. The court officer reviewed the bids, confirmed the bid structure and qualification documentation, and awarded the acquisition to Vance Holdings LLC. I had purchased back my own company for $2,140,000, which was $860,000 less than its professional valuation when Kevin had taken full control of it. The remaining $207,000 of the Vance Holdings account balance I retained as operating capital for the immediate restoration phase. I did not celebrate when the gavel came down. I shook Arthur's hand. I thanked the court officer. I walked out of Hammond's offices into the cold December morning and stood on the sidewalk on Madison Avenue for a moment, looking at the bare trees along the median and thinking about Patricia, who would have had something very precise and very warm to say about this particular morning. I thought she would have been proud, not of the maneuvering. Patricia had a clear, no-nonsense sense about the difference between necessary action and score settling, and she would have made sure I understood which this was. She would have been proud that I protected what we built together. She would have been proud that I was bringing it home. The restoration process began the following week. Arthur and I had prepared the necessary corporate documents during the period between the receivership filing and the auction, anticipating the acquisition and wanting to move quickly once the legal transfer was complete. The first action was the simplest and the most important. The company was formally renamed Vance HVAC Distribution. Not Apex anything, not a rebrand with market research and brand equity consultants. Vance HVAC Distribution, the name that had been on the building and on the trucks and on the invoices and on the business cards and on the minds of every contractor and client and employee who had ever done business with us since 1987. The second action was restoring the pension structure. The lump sum settlement offer Kevin and Dana had proposed to replace my pension was rescinded, and the original pension framework was reinstated with appropriate actuarial adjustments for the period during which it had been suspended. I also reinstated the supplemental support arrangements for the 3 retired employees Kevin had specifically identified at the family dinner as waste. I wrote personal letters to each of them explaining that their arrangements were restored and would remain so. The third action was re-establishing the charitable commitments. I called the Memphis area legal services and explained that the annual donation would be resuming and that I apologized for the interruption. I called the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital giving office and restored our quarterly gift designation. The woman I spoke with there had a warm, professional voice, and when I told her the donation was being restored in memory of my wife Patricia, there was a brief pause before she thanked me, and I appreciated the weight she gave that pause. Margaret Holloway agreed to stay on as CFO. That conversation took place over lunch at a restaurant neither of us had suggested for any occasion-related reason. Just a reliable, unpretentious place on Poplar that made good soup and where you could have a real conversation without ambient noise competing with it. Margaret was, as she had always been, direct and clear-eyed. She told me she had suspected something was wrong with the Meridian invoices for approximately 8 months before everything broke open, but had not had a clear pathway to investigate independently without Kevin's knowledge. She said she was relieved. She said she wanted to stay and help rebuild the vendor relationships and the client contracts that had been damaged. I told her I was glad and that I valued her more than I had probably told her over the years. She said I had told her more than I thought, but that she would accept it as a retroactive accumulation. The legal consequences for Kevin were moving through their own separate process, which was not something I controlled or tried to influence. The forensic audit findings had been formally referred to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for potential criminal fraud charges. Civil proceedings had been initiated by the receivership estate to recover the misappropriated funds. Kevin had retained criminal defense counsel, which meant the family money, whatever remained of it, was going toward defending against the consequences of how Kevin had managed the family money. I am not a vindictive man. I want to be clear about that. The outcome I had pursued was not Kevin's suffering. It was the restoration of what I had built and the protection of the people who depended on it. If there is a difference between those things, it lies in what you do when the opportunity for vindictiveness presents itself and you choose not to take it. I could have made the audit process more publicly painful for Kevin than it was. I chose not to. I let the professional and legal processes operate without additional pressure from me once they were in motion. What happened with Dana was not something I engineered or anticipated, though I cannot honestly say it surprised me. The month following the receivership and the auction, Dana filed for divorce from Kevin. I learned this from Kevin himself, in a brief and unexpectedly civil phone call he made to me in January, the first conversation we'd had since the brief, sharp exchange during the audit week. He was different on the phone than he had been then. He wasn't plaintive exactly, but the velocity was gone from his voice, the fast-moving defensive energy that had characterized him for the past several years. He sounded like a younger man than he was, which is not a compliment in the context I mean it. He sounded like someone who had run very fast for a very long time and had finally stopped because the ground had given way. He said Dana had filed. He said the attorneys were working through it. He didn't say anything else about it, and I didn't ask. I told him I was sorry to hear it. I told him that sincerely, because whatever Dana had married into, and whatever she had brought to that restaurant table with her padfolio, a divorce is a hard thing, and Kevin was still my son. He asked if the company was running again. I told him we were in the restoration phase. I told him we were rebuilding the vendor relationships, and that 2 of the 3 suspended commercial contracts had been reinstated after meetings I'd had with the clients directly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was probably as close to undefended as I had heard from him in years, that he had learned something from it. I said I hoped so. I didn't tell him what I wished for him, because some things are better kept where they are most real, which is inside. What I wished for Kevin was that he would do the work of becoming a person who didn't need to take what wasn't his, and that he would find a way to build something of his own that he could feel the full weight of. Because that weight, that specific gravity of having made something from nothing, is the thing that teaches you not to squander it. But I have learned, at 67, that you cannot give a person that knowledge. They have to earn it the long way. The porch at my house in Memphis faces east, which means that in the early morning, when the light comes up over the city, it comes up directly at you, not harsh but present, the way light is present in winter when the air is clear and there aren't enough leaves to soften it. I have been spending more mornings on that porch since the restoration began, with coffee and the kind of quiet that a man earns when he has finished a significant piece of work and can afford to simply sit for a moment before the next thing. Memphis spreads out beyond my street in every direction, a city I have known my entire adult life, a city whose particular rhythms and textures and contradictions I understand the way you understand a place you have built something in, not just observed, but actually built something in, with your hands and your time and the money that represented the years of your life converted into financial form. I have warehouses in this city. I have contracts with contractors who have been doing business with us since Kevin was in grade school. I have retired employees who call on holidays and whose grandchildren's names I know. Those things belong to something that cannot be transferred by a wire authorization, or dissolved by a restructuring proposal, or renamed by a brand consultant. They belong to the accumulated reality of decades of work done honestly and relationships tended carefully, and they were here when I came back for them, recognizable and real, the way the things you have truly built always are when you return to them after they've been tested. Legacy is not what you put your name on. It is what you are willing to protect when the cost of protecting it is high. It is what you refuse to abandon when the people who should have valued it have demonstrated that they do not. It is the commitment, renewed at each moment when it would be easier to walk away, to treat the work as worthy of the effort the work has always required. Kevin told me to stop wasting his money. He had the causality exactly backwards, which is perhaps understandable for a man who had spent his career studying business, rather than building one. The money was not his because he controlled it. The control was always provisional. What made the company real? What made the accounts meaningful? What made the name worth anything at all? Was 38 years of daily decision-making by a man who understood that a business is not an asset to be managed. It is a living relationship between the people who build it and the people it serves. You don't own that by signing a transition document. You earn it. Or you don't. I earned it. I picked up my coffee cup, which had gone lukewarm in the December air, and I drank the last of it standing at the porch railing, with the Memphis morning coming up around me. The bookcase in the study was finished. The pension arrangements were restored. The trucks were running again with the Vance name on the side. The original font, the original colors, the original everything, because some things should not be changed, simply because someone decided they could change them. The attorney who drafted my first contracts in 1987 had been right about one thing above all else when he sat across from me in his office on Union Avenue in the spring of that year and reviewed the articles of incorporation before I signed them. He had told me, in his dry and precise way, to be careful about what I signed and what I didn't sign, because the things you build are only as permanent as the documents that protect them. I had been careful. Careful enough to wait 38 years for a Tuesday night in September and a son who called something his when it was mine. Careful enough to know, when the moment came, exactly which accounts to empty.